Hello, everybody. I always say hello, everybody, which is really quite irritating. I've noticed this when I watch a lot of the previous videos I've done. It seems to be a standard thing to say hello, everybody. So I just say it, it's automatically, maybe it's become a catchphrase now. Right, this is going to be a complex logistically for us in the sense that we're also doing a simulcast over Facebook as well, and I'm hoping the technology is going to be working. Now, for you guys on Facebook, you can see me, but you won't be able to see Sarah, but you should be able to see her, and I don't know whether Sarah's managed to set herself up in a similar way, but we shall see as we go on. Right, really looking forward to this talk and interview. Sarah and I have been in contact for a couple of years on Facebook, but we only really properly met when we both did this amazing event at Drakelow Tunnels in the Midlands of the UK last April, when we tried to reproduce the various things, including Plato's cave. And if Sarah and I get the opportunity, we'll chat a little bit about that as well, because it very much fits in work. Now, Sarah sent me some information about herself, which I'm going to be reading out now, just to let you know a little bit about her and her background. So, now, Sarah Janes is an independent researcher with particular interest in the ancient practice of dream incubation and temple sleep. She's currently writing a book about the sleep temples of ancient Greece, Asclepions, with special emphasis on the role of the goddess Mnemosyne, personification of memory and sense-making in these sacred precincts. A passionate Egyptomaniac, I love that, Sarah is teaching herself to read hieroglyphs and as in an attempt to understand ancient Egyptian ideas about spirituality, the nature of reality, and the dream state more deeply. Sarah regularly gives talks about dream incubation and hosts lucid dreaming workshops in which these ancient techniques of sleep hypnosis are utilized to guide participants through the hypnagogic state and into conscious dreaming. Sarah also has a passion for ancient magic and herb lore. She makes potions and herbal remedies for sleeping and dreaming, inspired by ancient documents such as the Greek magical papyri. Sarah is also working on a couple of projects that harness the emerging technologies of mixed reality with this ancient wisdom. Alongside Carl H. Smith of Ravensbourne University, who will be a future guest on this show, she has developed a mixed reality mystery school initiation experience. She's also had a fascination since her lucid dreams in childhood with the potential for a dream recording device, and has recently started sharing research with Daniel Aldis, a sleep scientist in California, who is working to develop a dream speech recorder. Wow, that is just so extraordinary. And last time Sarah and I met in London, she'd just come back from the British Museum, and she was showing me how hieroglyphics work, and it really is fascinating. So this is going to be a really fascinating interview. So Sarah, without further ado, how are you today?
I'm very excellent, thank you.
Oh, that's good. Now, one of the things that ever since I've known about your work, there have been so many questions I've always wanted to ask you, but never had the opportunity to do so because we're always doing events and things, or we're meeting with other people. So the billion-dollar question is then, what exactly is dream incubation?
Well, I think essentially it's the idea that you go to have a ritual dream in which you can have contact with a god or a divine entity. And so it's dreaming with intention, really, and the ancients used it with particular emphasis on having contact with the gods. So we can practice dream incubation in a modern way by setting an intention before we go to dream to resolve a problem or sort out an issue or an idea that we have, or come up with a brilliant idea for a new invention, something like that. So it's really trying to consciously enter a dream state and bring about the outcome that you desire.
And how do you go about doing that? What kind of techniques can you do to do that?
Well, even in a very simple way these days, we could write down what we would like to dream about. We could imagine it in our waking reality. We could go through ritual processes such as maybe praying to some deity or setting the perfect temple environment, things like ritual purifications, burning incense, things like that, setting up a ritualistic ceremonial environment before going into sleep with a particular purpose in mind.
Okay, so it's a matter of really, we are manipulating almost our own reality here in terms of our dream state, by deciding where we're going to go in our dream state, by trying to control the dream environment. Now, one of the things that in your introduction, or the introduction I read, one of the things that really intrigued me was that clearly you have been involved in lucid dreaming in childhood and from a very young age, and it clearly has developed you into some fascinating areas. So how did you first start with lucid dreaming? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's always good to have a kind of a picture of how somebody ends up where they are.
I actually think the reasons why I got into lucid dreaming were very kind of practical kind of humdrum reasons. One of them, I think, is because I had a cabin bed when I was a kid, and my dad built it out of MDF, and it didn't have a kind of safety rail. So I think when I was lying in bed, I was very conscious of the fact that I mustn't move around too much in case I fall off and kill myself. And also, there wasn't really a ladder that I recall, and I think also in the middle of the night I might need to go for a wee, and I didn't want to wake up to go for a wee, so I'd often have dreams where I'd need to go for a wee in the dream and then become conscious in the dream because of that.
Because that is the perfect way, isn't it? Becoming self-aware is that very sensation. So you become aware, but you don't really want to fully wake up, and it almost is.
Most people, if they have a regular lucid dreaming practice, will have started lucid dreaming in childhood, and mostly it's as the result of becoming aware that they're in a dream whilst they're having a nightmare.
Right.
So, for example, I had a lucid dream, or I had a dream when I was a kid where I was being repeatedly chased. It was like a recurring dream where I'd be chased, and no matter what the dream was, I'd be being chased, but it would be like different kinds of people chasing me all the time. And then one time I remember being chased, but my hiding place was so good that I knew I was the only person that knew my hiding place, and I was still caught by these, I think they were transformers. And in my kind of conscious awareness at that time, I thought, oh, they must be an aspect of myself, because I know that I'm the only person that knows where I've hidden in this instance. So I kind of became lucid in that moment and realized that I didn't have to be scared of the people that were chasing me. And I never had that recurring dream again after that either.
That's intriguing, isn't it? So it means effectively becoming aware of the circumstances of a dream circumstance actually makes the trauma, maybe the background trauma, disappear in some way.
Yeah, that's the classic integrating the shadow aspect of it, so that instead of being fearful of a scary presence or a demonic presence or a dark presence in a dream, you embrace it, and in the embracing of it, the energy of the shadow changes and transforms completely.
And were you able to then, having at a really early age realize that you could lucid dream, were you then able to manipulate your environments in the dream environment to do things ordinarily that you would not have been able to do if you'd been ordinarily dreaming?
Yeah, like flying, stuff like that. We were talking actually when we met in London, weren't we, about how my dreaming when I was a kid would take place in this kind of Wonderland almost, which is why I loved Alice in Wonderland so much. And it was another realm that I could draw a map of. And I might find myself in one particular part of that realm, but I would also know, I'd be conscious of where that realm was in relationship to everywhere else in the dream world, I suppose.
And did you do that by exploring the dream environment, or did you seem to subliminally know where you were located within the dream environment?
No, I did explore it, and often you'd find yourself on the fringes or the borders of particular areas, and you would see the other places in the distance and things like that. But also, you do have this kind of omnipotence in the dream state, I find sometimes, where you see things, for example, like close up and far away at the same time. So you might see like the hair follicles on an animal, and at the same time see it roaming the plains in the distance.
Yeah, that's curious, isn't it? In the sense that you're seeing things from two completely almost opposite perspectives, and yet you're perceiving them simultaneously. Because because the one thing that's always intrigued me about lucid dream states, and there are many people I work with who are in true lucid dream states, is how we are perceiving, what is doing the perceiving. Because effectively in the dream state, it's illuminated in some way. It has this kind of three-dimensional reality, but we're not looking through our eyes. We're not hearing using our ears. It's either all brain created or it's consciousness going completely somewhere else. Now, what are your thoughts on this? Because I know we'll get into the greater detail of the ancient Greeks and everything at the moment, but it's something that I've always wondered. Do you believe that the reality you go to in a lucid dream state exists whether you are perceiving it or not? Is it a place you go that is always there and you're just accessing it like we do consensual reality?
It's a generated realm from your consciousness, and there's the potential for you to make contact with the collective consciousness, but I don't think that's necessarily always the case. One thing that I've learned from doing the wild technique, you know, the wake-induced dream thing.
Can you just explain to everybody what a wild is? It's quite important that it's an acronym. So, if you
so a wild is a wake-induced dream, and this is generally come about by lying on your bed, entering the hypnagogic state and kind of following the thread of the visuals, the hallucinations that you start having until you're fully embedded in a dream state and you're completely aware and conscious of it as well.
Somebody who, in fact, last night I had this morning when I was waking up, I had a whole series of really powerful hypnopompic states. And it was interesting that you mentioned that as how you then, when you're in that state, how do you then pull yourself in? Can you explain? Because I'm sure that everybody would be fascinated to know how to do this. And I know personally I am, because I can never hold on to them long enough.
One of the things that I would give an example of when I talk about it in my workshops is, I don't know if when you were a kid, did you ever do that thing where you push your palms into your eye sockets like that and you start to travel through a kind of tunnel of stars? And one of the reasons why I think our kind of dreaming capabilities are diminishing a little bit is because we don't have the sort of forward vision or the third eye vision. We don't have that practice regularly enough to recognize how to travel through a hypnagogic state. So when you are beginning to fall asleep and you start, I mean, often you will have audio hallucinations as well. You might hear like a doorbell go or someone call your name. And the idea really is keeping that forward motion going in your inner vision. So you're traveling through a tunnel. Yeah. And as soon as you come to like a 2D type looking at something, you almost snap out of it instantaneously. It's like focusing too much on the surface. You need to look through it. One of the other examples I might give is something like, do you remember those magic eye paintings that were like big in the 90s?
I could never do. I could never make them work.
Exactly. Well, that's the way that you have to look at those, is kind of the way you have to look on when you've got closed eyelids through space. And the trick they always gave for that was, if you look at a magic eye painting in a frame and you look at the depth of the reflection in the frame with the kind of painting behind it, and you use it to kind of look through into another dimension, that's how you see in a dream.
Wow, that's really interesting, because I will be trying this, because...
Well, one of my friends, you know, Engelbert Winkler, one of the inventors of the Lucia lamp, a hypnagogic lamp, he gave me this really good exercise, and I think this is a quite easy way for people to do it, is to pretend that they're experiencing sleep paralysis, and you kind of conjure that idea up. So you make your body not, I mean, I find you have hypnagogia, you become aware of hypnagogia quite easily just when you first get into bed and you're lying on your back. And then what people tend to do is they get a bit comfy and cozy and sleepy and they roll over on their side, and then they go into a kind of unconscious, you know, where they go into a dream proper or a sleep proper. But actually, when you're lying on your back, that's usually when you have the most hypnagogic visual experience. So if you can keep yourself in that position, so Engelbert's idea of like staying in a sleep paralysis mode is really good. So you just train yourself up to become more and more consistent in that experience. And then eventually, I mean, what you find during the wild technique, as I was saying earlier, is that any little vague thought, idea, word becomes and manifests into part of the dream environment. So if you think of a person, you'll see their face suddenly, and you follow the thread of that until eventually you can see that your thoughts and ideas are generating the material of the dream content.
Wow. Because one of the things that, probably we're assuming about the knowledge of these things of the people that are listening in, but very quickly, can you just explain what the hypnagogic state is, so that people, because people, whenever I mention this, that you see this, it sounds like an incredibly complex term, and then suddenly this little light goes on. Oh yeah, I get that. So could you just explain what an hypnagogic image is and how
it's just that very colourful, often imaginative state that you fall into when you first get into bed and you start falling asleep. You start the process of falling asleep. And one of the things I say to people is that, do you ever have that experience when you're dreaming, you might be walking along and you trip on a curb and you go like that? That's called a myoclonic jerk. And that's usually what occurs in the hypnagogic state. Those kind of experiences are generally in the hypnagogic state. So it's that kind of thing where you could snap out of it at any minute. You're not quite totally asleep.
I see. Okay, so this is the perfect segue then into ancient Greece. So first, how did you become interested in the whole thing of sleep temples in ancient Greece? How did you get involved in it? Because it's a very obscure and very precise area of ancient Greek research. So what was it that made you think, this is where I'm going to go?
Well, actually, it was kind of accidental. I run a little lecture club down here, because you're coming to talk at my lecture club, so you know that, called the Explorers Club. And one of the speakers I've had a couple of times is Dr. David Luke. And he was talking about lucid dreaming, and I was telling him about my lifelong interest in lucid dreaming. And he said that there was a sleep temple in this country, actually, a Roman sleep temple at Lydney Park in Gloucestershire. And one time I was on a Tinder date, and I made an archaeologist drive me to this sleep temple. So I went to check it out. And then I was just hooked on the whole concept of sleep temples and the whole idea. And they just really appealed to, I've always had an interest in ancient cultures and ancient spiritual religious ideas. And I've kind of come to the point now where I think that dream incubation experiences were the first human experiences of spiritual transcendence. The first religious experiences, I think, were created out of dream incubation.
So when you went to the dream temple, were you allowed into the environment of the dream temple? And what happened?
Pretty much a ruin. It's an absolutely beautiful location, but I could see all the elements there. And one of the things I've had a kind of lifelong, well, I've had lots of lucid dreams about springs, natural springs, and this desire and need to get to this spring of either eternal life or eternal wisdom. And nearly all sleep temples will have a natural water source there. And there was just something that felt very intuitive and all my kind of interests in life basically merged at that point. So everything that I'm interested in has to do with the ritual process of dreaming, the potential contact that you have to make with the collective unconscious, and the wisdom that you can imbibe. I think when you drink from natural springs, you can drink, I believe, like the wisdom of the earth, like the essence of the earth when you drink natural water.
Okay, because the term you've used many times is the collective unconscious. And again, to not talk down at the audience, but just to make sure that we don't lose people on this, when you use, because it's a very precise term, and what do you mean when you use the term collective unconscious?
I think we kind of exist in a matrix of consciousness, and that at times we feel we're able to tap into that, and perhaps it represents a sort of eternal timelessness, a pool of spirit that we all emerge from.
I see, because I know it's very much, again, the Jungian idea, isn't it? You know, and what Jung said about this collective unconscious. Now, I would interpret that, and I have interpreted it in my writings with being the information field, the Akashic record, the Akashic field, whatever we like to call it. But clearly, there does seem to be something we can attune into under certain circumstances. It seems to open up, and it almost downloads into us, and we then move into that. So, in terms of, the ancient Greeks must have clearly twigged this very early on. So can you tell us a little bit about the sleep? Well, how you discovered then from the Roman sleep temple to the ancient Greek temples, and how they functioned and how they work, and what was the philosophical basis of all that?
Well, some of the earliest ideas about dream incubation were that very, very ancient people, maybe even worshippers of one of the earliest cults, which would be the mother cult, slept directly on the earth. And in the process of doing that, believed that they would receive wisdom from the earth as a sentient being. And I'm really interested in like the mother goddess interpretation. And I think that it's an example of how if you give something form, you can create almost an avatar that can exist and have life. You can give life to it in the dream state. So I believe that very ancient people who developed these mother cults all over the world looked at the kind of fertile, voluptuous landscape all around them and believed that they lived on this huge feminine body. And they had this idea, so they tried to create little statues that represented this. And in creating these representations, they created characters that could then people their dreams. And then religion becomes complex, and the pantheons of gods expand as we move down the centuries and find ourselves in quite complicated religious systems like ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, for example. So in ancient Egypt, dream incubation is also well documented. And anywhere really that there are temples, there's this idea that a temple is a sacred precinct in which if you go there, sleep there, you can have contact with the god, because the god is always seen to dwell in that sacred precinct almost exclusively. Like they may not necessarily be able to make contact with humans anywhere else. So if you go into the sacred precinct, you can have contact with the god. And the Asclepians, the ancient Greek sleep temples, were the same. The Asclepians were the sacred precinct of the god Asclepius. And even within those sleep temples, there were even smaller areas where the god would make his appearance to the supplicants.
Why is it intriguing, isn't it, as to why it begs certain questions, doesn't it? Because ancient peoples, you know, had exactly the same brain power as we did. The same.
I think they had a very different perception of reality, and they experienced a different form of consciousness and a very different form of memory to modern humans, actually.
Which dovetails very nicely into something that is almost a pun on your surname, because of Julian James. And Julian James and his bicameral mind. What's your opinions on that? Well, you can give a little bit of background information, but what's your opinions on that? And does that fit in with your overall position and hypothesis?
I think it's valuable, especially in as far as I think it's very likely that human consciousness has changed as we've evolved as a species. And with the advent of language, I think that's when everything started changing exponentially. And one of the things that I really love about learning hieroglyphs is their magical spell-making power. And as soon as you start bringing language, words, and abstract sound values into symbols, you completely change the way that you think about the world. Like if you think about anything, it usually involves words and sounds, and ancient people, before they ever used language, didn't have that. They just had what was in front of them. And so the invention of words and language and dreaming, I think, had this feedback system. And probably some of the first documents ever produced, the first written stories, came from dreaming. And then what you find if you do a dreaming practice, the dream journaling process and writing dreams down and bringing dreams out from the kind of unconscious or the subconscious into the conscious realm, that then feeds in to give you more dreams along those kinds of themes. And so it's a kind of self-fueling activity.
Yeah, because I read an academic paper recently that really intrigued me, that was discussing the way in which the Greek language, although after our meeting last week, I'm not too sure whether that is necessarily correct in terms of hieroglyphics, but they were saying that the Greek language was the first language that actually broke down the actual physical phonemes, the physical sounds like dog, D-O-G, and the letters symbolized certain sounds, which meant that the sound itself became almost like a Platonic form, and the word itself took on a meaning and a power that was greater. But, you know, when you were talking through with Sam and I about the hieroglyphics, it clearly seemed to me that hieroglyphics do that as well. There's a phonetic element to hieroglyphics. They're not just symbols of things in external reality, like a goat or a cow or anything else. They're more complex than that, aren't they?
Yeah, they're really complex. And I've looked at them lots in the past. And then actually, just very recently, I found a book that explains them really easily. And it's kind of opened up this whole world. And I was saying to you just before I met you, I was with Sam in the British Museum, and it's the first time that I've been there and kind of added sound values to the inscriptions as I've seen them on the tombs and stuff, and it was amazing. It was really good. But learning the structure of hieroglyphs, so you have a phonetic element, you have what's called a determinative or determinatives at the end of a word to show you what word it's referring to. And very, very early Egyptian hieroglyphs would have been just symbolic representations. So even the phonetic value still has a symbolic or meaningful reference. So for example, the Egyptian word for foretell, the determinative is a giraffe, which seems quite abstract, but makes sense because a giraffe is very tall, so it can see things coming from far away. So there's lots of just very kind of simple, if you get into the Egyptian mindset of the time, you can kind of make sense of their language.
That is absolutely fascinating, and you know, language has fascinated me ever since I was at university many years ago, because I did a course on the sociology of language and the development of language. And you know, language, there is the argument, like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that language actually determines how we perceive reality to a greater or lesser extent. But clearly, the process of actually writing things down suddenly gives them a permanence, and it means that you can actually continue forward. And clearly, this is something that the ancient Greeks did. So the sleep temples, how did they function? What was the process that people went through in a Greek temple then?
They were really the dominant healing sanctuary of the ancient Greek world. So they were our equivalent of hospitals, but probably much more healthy than our hospitals now, because they were all about relaxing, fresh air. They're often in beautiful countryside locations. Some people think that in order to attend an Asclepion, you had to first have a dream of Asclepius telling you to go, which I quite like that idea. It may or may not be true, but I like the idea of it. Anyway, before you went, you had to fast for at least a day, had to abstain from alcohol for 3 days. The purification aspect of it was seen as quite important, but it wasn't massively strict. A lot of people compare it to the mystery initiation systems, and I think there is definitely an aspect of the mystery experience in the dream chamber as in the final stage. So you'd go through these periods of purification. You'd have to make your offerings. Asclepius favoured the cock, so you'd have to sacrifice a cock on his altar, and you may have to pay some money. They were into cold water bathing. So there were springs. They weren't generally hot springs. They were usually cold springs. But the cold water bathing was seen as an important part of the Asclepian ritual. Then there is a ritual that wasn't necessarily in all ancient Greek sleep temples, but it's one that really interests me, which is this final stage before you entered what was called the abaton, which was this small dream chamber that you'd go into for your like final divine dream, where Asclepius would come and contact you. And before you entered that, you'd have to invoke the goddess Mnemosyne, the personification of memory. And I love this because I think that this is what really makes me think that ancient people had a different memory capability to modern humans, that their dream memory and their memory were more integrated somehow. And that's why the gods and the very long time spans that they planned for were so important to them, because they had this idea of ancestors and future generations that maybe we are less always aware of in our modern lives.
Because it's one of the things I did a talk in London last week, and one of the points I was making when somebody said, you know, why do people not have extraordinary experiences anymore? Why do they not have encounters with the other, for want of another term? And I argued that, you know, we live within little boxes. We always exist. We never are close to the physical world, the physical universe. And, you know, one of the things that our mutual friend Kaz Coronel was saying recently in one of her postings, and Kaz will be a future guest on this show, and Kaz was saying how every morning she takes herself out and she actually walks barefooted on the ground, which gives you a direct contact, this kind of telluric force that actually runs within you. But of course, you know, we never see the sky properly. We always have roofs over ourselves. Whereas when the ancient Greeks were out there in that wonderful Greek climate, you know, in the summer where it was balmy, you could sit outside and you can almost sense the timelessness of it all, you know, and that's because we're both massively in love with Greece for obvious reasons, because it's such a wonderful place. But it's this kind of thing. So do you think it was possible then for people, you say about the Asclepion, it's something I'd never known before. I'd always taken an Asclepion, like the Asclepion on Kos, to be a hospital, you know, the Hippocrates.
It was a hospital, but I think the ancient Greeks put a lot more store by the mind-body connection and this idea of harmonizing a person in order to bring them into health. And that's something I think we're going to return to. The future of medicine will return to that, because already there's a lot of research into sound healing and frequencies affecting tumours and things like that. So I think we're actually going to return to a more harmonious approach to healthcare.
So do you think it's possible for somebody to be cured in a dream?
Yes, I definitely do. And I think that, so for example, when you went into the Abaton and in the final stage of it, you would sleep on the skin of a sacrificed black ram on a special bed that was called the kline. And I think sometimes when people think about dreams, dream work or healing, they think about a person going into bed and falling properly asleep. But this was almost more of a sort of sleep hypnosis process. So don't forget as well, you've been in this amazing sleep temple, this huge sanctuary. There'll be theatres and all sorts of stuff in these complexes. They were like a kind of Butlins for ancient Greeks, like a really, well, much nicer Butlins actually. But there would be all kinds of entertainments and ritual processes going on. So there would be quite a lot of anticipation. And one of the things that covered all of the walls of the Asclepion would be these offerings from people that had previously been cured by Asclepius. And Asclepions functioned for thousands of years. And I think there's a lot to do there with subconscious programming, like hypnotic suggestion, that Asclepius has these healing magical powers. And in this final sleep chamber you might go into, there would be a statue of Asclepius. And Asclepius, as you know, is represented with the rod of Asclepius, which is a rod with a snake entwined around it, which is still the symbol for physicians to this day. And I think if you can imagine yourself in a sort of trance-like hypnagogic state, there's a statue of Asclepius, there's snakes. Snakes were allowed to like go wherever they wanted to in these sleep temples. They were sacred animals, and the snake was seen as the animal form of the god as well. So they were treated with great reverence. So in the dream state, if you had contact with a snake, you had been touched by the animal form of Asclepius. And I think if you or I slept in our beds tonight and there were loads of snakes slithering around on the floor, there's a good chance that we would have a snake type encounter in our dream. So anyway, a lot of the accounts, a lot of these offerings at the end, these like plaques and things like this, the ostraka, they will say things like, Asclepius came to me in the dream, chopped off my head and tipped out some bees. So sometimes he performs these like physically impossible operations. And I think the way this works is, especially if you imagine these patients being lucid during this dream state, let's say, which I think is highly likely, the kind of visual stimuli that they're getting and the full body experience of this really happening to them can have a really powerful effect on their body. And in this lucid dream state where they're having contact with this divine healer, their mind and body integration is at the most maximum it could ever be. It's like the perfect foundation for a placebo effect or a faith healing response to take place. So I had a dream once I'd started all this research. I was also really into Ahura Mazda at the time that I had this dream, where Ahura Mazda came to me, and he was just a being of light that came down from the sky. And as he came down from the sky, the light entered my body. And then I could see close up inside my body that my DNA spirals untwisted, and he stepped down the ladders of my DNA and they lit up as he was walking down them. And that's the kind of experience you're never going to have in waking reality. But in a dream state, if you're lucid, that's the kind of thing that could have a profound biophysical response from your body if you're in a lucid state, because, you know, your frontal cortex is activated, you're really experiencing this. And I think your body will respond to it as if it's really happening.
Wow. I just, Dia, did you want to come in there? Or Dia, did I hear you call in there a second?
No, I'm just chattering in the background, concurring. I just find it interesting, I guess, the wording as things in the past. I mean, these things that you're talking about have been going on for a very long time. I mean, indigenous people still exist and we're still practicing these things. So the things that you're speaking about, I can connect to my own priesthood and what we do in reference to dreaming and things of this nature, and the things that I've been taught as a daughter of Yemaya. So they're still in existence, they're still here, however, they're not in the public sphere, if you will.
Thanks, dear, that's good. So moving on then, sorry, my computer's wanting to reconnect and making lots of noises, which it inevitably will. These are the archons, they always bother us. But we live with these. So in terms of dreaming, how do you think that dreaming has developed human culture? How has it contributed to the human culture itself?
I think dreaming has had a huge influence on human culture. And like the ancient Egyptians believed with the hieroglyphs, that you know, there was a magical process that happened if you wrote it down, or you created an imaginary version of it, you were halfway to manifesting it in reality. So I think we can work with dreams to manifest policy in reality. And so if people dream of something, they then can create something. And I think that there are various different kind of cultural developments that have been expanded in the dream state, that have been developed in the dream state, that then can come to fruition in waking reality. So we get really great ideas in the dream state often. I think we have contact with our higher self and our best version of ourselves often. So we can get divine inspiration in the dream state and apply that to our waking lives. But I do believe that the relationship between writing and dreaming is very important, and that dreaming and writing work together to kind of co-create one another.
That's an interesting idea, isn't it? Almost like automatic writing, and the idea that you can actually in some way delve into your deep subconscious when you're doing automatic writing. I guess that's the thing you mean with that.
Yeah, well, this is why I find the hieroglyphs so incredibly fascinating, because the Egyptians had this magical thinking down. Like, if they wrote something, they made it real in some way. If they wrote the characteristics, the great, wonderful characteristics of a person, they made it real. And if you can learn to control your dreams, you can create the things that you want in the dream state. And I think, you know, I believe in a kind of vibrational nature of reality. And I think that if you can create something in the high vibrational state of lucid dream, eventually it will trickle down to manifest into concrete reality.
Well, that was it, because last time we met, I was just so intrigued watching you doing the hieroglyphs and using your pen to do it. It was very aesthetically pleasing as well. You know, it's the idea of
beautiful meditative process. And I think it's not been very long that human beings have almost neglected handwriting, really. And now we're all kind of typing rapidly at a keyboard, and there's a disconnect from the magical process of putting pen to paper and committing a shape and a meaning to reality. Because where does typed text ever really exist? It doesn't exist in the same way as a hieroglyph exists carved into stone. It doesn't even exist the way a penned letter exists on paper. It kind of is nowhere.
Yeah, it's almost as if in terms of our own evolution as a species, because we're moving away from actually writing things down. And I find now my handwriting is deteriorating. It's not as good as it was. And I find I make, and we discussed this again last time we met, I make extensive notes. I've got notebooks everywhere. And it's because, and I read somewhere recently, there's research being shown that you learn much better if you actually physically write something down. There's an engagement of both the physicality of writing it down, which then engages into the brain, whereas there's a kind of disassociation when you're using a keyboard. It's
yeah,
not...
that ties in with the idea of Mnemosyne, this personification of memory. She's the goddess of remembrance, really. And when you write down, you go through a process of remembering, and you're kind of integrating imagination and reality together. You're like tying them together at that point of writing.
That is very interesting. And funnily enough, after our meeting, I started looking up, because we discussed, didn't we, about words themselves and word roots and everything. And I started rereading some of my books on linguistics and my books on the development of language, and, you know, how certain root words work in certain ways. They go back down to the Indo-European and we carry them through, and how words seem to create the reality around them. Of course, we know the magical traditions are always saying you have incantations, you use words, you use music and everything else. So what do you think for us, what does the future hold for dreams in terms of human society? Where do you think dreaming is going to take us, particularly now with the work you're doing in virtual reality and mixed reality? It's a very exciting time for us, because we can exist almost in these dreamscapes, can't we?
I hope that we're going to return to an appreciation of the dream state, because one thing that's interesting and kind of parallel with a lot of the projects I do is this renaissance of psychedelic substances and entheogens. And actually, I wonder if maybe a lot of people have lost the ability to recall their dreams and become lucid. And this is a kind of an effect of how sped up our society is now, how sped up culture is. We are using like blue light emitting devices constantly. We have so much artificial light, and you know, your cycles of REM sleep kind of work with the natural cycles of light and dark. And if we're in constantly artificially lit environments, our melatonin production can disrupt our circadian rhythms. So I think we need to be very mindful, because I think a good dreaming society will be healthy and sane. And if we don't have good dreams, we won't process the things that we need to process as they arise in our psyche. We're going to be suppressing them. We're going to, as a society, become increasingly mentally ill.
Well, since you said that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Anthony, but Sarah, do you have any good a very simple, practical tool for our audience so they can actually take you up on what you just said?
Yeah, I think the easiest ways to get into a regular practice of going to sleep and having a good quality sleep, because often the way and the manner in which you fall asleep affects the whole night's dreaming. So if you fall asleep kind of erratically in front of the telly, stuff like that, it can affect your dreams later on in the night. So I would suggest sleep hypnosis. I've got a sleep hypnosis track on my website, but if you go on Spotify, there's quite a few lucid dream sleep hypnosis tracks. I think sleep hypnosis is amazing and one of the best and easiest tools you can use.
So how would we both, as you probably know, I was right at the early days of the hypnagogic light device, the Lucia device, around about 10 years ago when Winkler and Procol first started developing it. And it's always intrigued me about how this works. What's your feeling about sort of how dream technology can work, how we can use technology to develop these things? Do you think that that's the right way forward, or do you think it should be done more naturally?
I do think that virtual reality has this space within it that a lot of flat screen technology hasn't had. So when you're using virtual reality, you find yourself in an environment, and it's not dissimilar to the way you feel when you're in a lucid dreaming environment. You're kind of moving around this imaginary realm. So I think a lot of lucid dreaming and dreaming is just being conscious of yourself in an imaginary realm. So the more you can practice that, perhaps the better and easier it'll be to lucid dream. I think virtual reality is probably preferable to flat screen technology, because flat screen, a lot of dreaming is about seeing, and it's how you see things. And if you're constantly looking at a flat screen, you're never looking through things and into an open space. And actually, we're kind of entraining ourselves now just to look at flat screen devices all the time.
That's a very good point, isn't it? The reality we normally live within is three-dimensional. Mm. Of course, intriguingly enough, with some of the latest research is suggesting that the reality we perceive is actually two-dimensional. We perceive as a three-dimension, but that's another aside. So what we now need to move on is the exciting project that we're trying to get started in terms of Alice in Wonderland. Can you tell everybody about the exciting things we're planning to be doing with this? Because I am so fired up with this. It's so cool. So can you explain what we're going to be doing?
Well, all three of us are massive, four of us, aren't there? Massive Alice in Wonderland fans. And Alice in Wonderland, I think, did fuel my interest in lucid dreams and working with the kind of, especially the map of the lucid dream realm. And so we're planning some events, maybe a series of events in London and potentially elsewhere as well, maybe Oxford, to coincide with the big V&A exhibition that's happening in the summertime in London. So we are looking at Alice in Wonderland from a altered state of consciousness, lucid dreaming perspective, which it doesn't often really get analysed in that way, interestingly, because that for me is the most fascinating aspect of Alice in Wonderland. It's all about a dream, but it's an especially unusual, fantastic, long lucid dream.
Yeah, it's good. And anybody who's interested as well. And by the way, this as you know, this is going out live as well on Facebook, and there's lots of comments. There's almost too many to fill. So there's obviously an awful lot of people listening into this live. And there's some interesting comments that people are making as well. So people are really buying into this. And guys, thank you very much for tuning in on this. It really is appreciated. But our two other people that are involved in, Sam Treasure and Emma McNeil, stroke Emma McCann, have also been previous guests on this show. And if we can work the technology correctly, what we might try and do is at some time in the future have all four of us discussing where we're going to be going with this. But what I'd like to do is just expand a little bit more, because when we last met, you made some fascinating points about Alice in Wonderland and some of the scenes in Alice in Wonderland that have intrigued you for a long time. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I really was fascinated by that.
I think what I love about Alice in Wonderland is it's a very realistic portrayal of a lucid dream for me. The fact that she's questioning herself all the time and she's constantly reminding herself who she is. And I'm really into birds as well. So the dodo scene has always really fascinated me, and the kind of morphing shapes and sizes has always interested me as well. And that kind of nicely depicts the lucid dream experience, where you're kind of changing focus, or you're able to see the big and then you're able to see the tiny at the same time as well. But one of the things I was thinking today, actually, it'd be really nice to do something about an interpretation of Alice in Wonderland as a sort of psychoanalysis of Lewis Carroll as well, because he's obviously a very intriguing character with a lot of things going on, but we don't really know an enormous amount about him. But it's potential, I think, to psychoanalyze that dream, because that's kind of what it is, really.
And your wonderful story about the dodo itself and the way in which the dodo in reality, please share that one. That's wonderful.
It's like a classic. As I was saying, I run this little lecture club down in St Leonards, and one of the lecturers I've had is Errol Fuller, who's like one of the most well-respected experts on extinct birds. He wrote a book with David Attenborough, and he was telling me that the year Alice Liddell, which was Lewis Carroll's muse, was obsessed with going to see this skull remain of the dodo in one of the museums in Oxford. And up until that time, that kind of fragment of the dodo was a sort of, it was a really mysterious, mythical creature at that point. People weren't quite sure that the dodo ever really existed. And the year Alice in Wonderland was published, the dodo obviously featured as a prominent character in the book. And that year, an expedition to Mauritius discovered hundreds and hundreds of skeletons of dodos in the Mérosange swamp. So the book almost manifested that discovery in a way. It kind of put the dodo into regular social consciousness.
Yes, it's almost like, one of the things in my new book, I discussed the concept of egregores, which is similar. That you can create the dodo egregore, which again, and we were discussing that I was down in Mauritius a few years ago, and I was very surprised that there was no play made on the dodo and indeed Alice in Wonderland and the kind of links. And we were discussing, weren't we, the way in which it seems to be very much either a British or British American fascination with the dodo. Now, one of the things that is a particular interest to us guys, and somebody that's actually on and listening in at the moment, is Laura Stuckey, who's over in the southern states of the United States. And her husband, his mother is very much involved with the Lewis Carroll Society, particularly because you may or may not be, you probably will be aware that he was vicar at Daresbury, just outside Warrington. And that's comparatively local to where I was born and brought up. And we need to probably maybe link in with this idea. And also another beautiful synergy here is that a previous person who's been interviewed here and will be involved in our work in the future is Luke Goldman Dodgson. And Luke is, as you guys will know, is J.B. Priestley's great-grandson. But when I last met Luke, we were discussing various things, and the name Dodgson came up. And it seems that Luke might be related to Dodgson through his father's family. So again, we have these kind of really weird linkages that are just kind of coming to us, which is absolutely fascinating. But very much we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. What I'd like to do now is to just talk a little bit about the other project that we're thinking of doing, which is actually recreating Plato's cave in Greece. And I know that you're going to be going down to Crete at some in the future to do some cave work or something. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm just going on holiday to Crete, but whilst I'm there, I'm going to do some expeditions into the caves. And you know, the earliest dream incubation was really cave based, and caves as these kind of portals to the underworld and entrances to the Mother Earth, and wombs and rebirthing processes, all of this kind of stuff. Like the cave was a really important aspect in very, very ancient religious ideas. So I might try and sleep in a cave if I can. I'm not sure whether that'll be possible, but there's loads of caves in Crete, and it's obviously a very important mythical place, and I love Crete. So, and the thing that I also love about Crete is their kind of herb wisdom. They're still very, very much in contact with their local herbs and the magical properties that they have, and the folk remedies. That kind of idea is still super strong in Crete. Dittany is one of my favorite. It gives you very romantic dreams, Dittany.
Oh, right. Because one of the certain places I've been on Crete that particularly, I thought Matala was a fascinating place, in the caves in Matala, and also up on the Lefkadora Mountains in the extreme west as well. And you have this kind of dreaminess that you get elsewhere in Greece, but I think because it's such a large island, you, like in Lasitha, you can get away from everywhere, and you really have this kind of timelessness that you cannot describe. And it's the smell of the herbs, isn't it? It's the time, everything else that kind
I
of...
love Knossos, and I think that the snake goddess of Knossos is probably a precursor to Asclepius, actually. And I think the snake healing deity was made masculine after the Olympian gods came in.
That is intriguing, because one of the areas that fascinates me about Knossos is the idea of the bull's horns and the symbolism of the horns and everything else, and obviously the symbolism of the loss of the Minotaur and the way in which you get lost within the labyrinth. Clearly, these are things that we're going to really start bringing out when we start working on the Greek exercise we're going to be doing. So we've got lots of interesting things, and again, as I said, it's going to be wonderful when Laura's husband Pete, and if we can do linkings with that as well. But finishing up then, you are involved. You always seem, when I first met you, you've absolutely fascinated me, because you're one of these people that's just interested in so many things, and you describe them in such an eloquent and fascinating way. I could listen to you for hours, you know, because you just talk about things. It's really, really wonderful. So can you tell us a little bit about your little group down in St Leonards, and the things you do in St Leonards, and if anybody wants to join in with that, also your website, how people can contact you, because I'm sure there's going to be an awful lot of people out there saying, this Sarah James, she's doing some fantastic stuff. I really need to talk to her. So how can people contact you? And tell us a little bit about your group.
Pretty much everything is on my website, which is www.themysteries.org. And that includes my lecture club that's down here that you're going to come to on April Fool's Day.
April Fool's Day, absolutely.
I'm also running a dream temple with Tree Car on the 1st and 2nd of February, and an out-of-body experience workshop with Jade Shaw on the 29th of February. So we're doing some experiential type workshops, but we have a regular once-a-month speaking gig as well.
That's great. And of course, Jade Shaw is going to be a future guest on this show, as is Dr. Carl H. Smith, who, again, you mentioned before in terms of working in the virtual reality thing. So this year seems to be really filling up with guests that are all part of the extended group that we are now developing, our own egregore group. And we have so many fascinating ideas. We're bubbling with ideas.
Yeah, Modern Mystery School, you know, headquarters, I think.
Well, that's it. Now, funnily enough, I don't know if I had the opportunity to mention to you, but when I did my event last week at Funzing, you know, the way in which Funzing seems to be ceasing to function. But I had a chat with the manager of Sing Pong, one of the major venues they have in London. And I've done 3 events there, and every event he's turned up because he loves my work so much. So I'm seeing him next week to discuss the viability of us using that as a base in London as well, so we can start really building, and maybe even starting some form of society to think about, because we then would have a base that we could meet once a month, when we could invite speakers in the same way that you do down in St Leonards. So very, very exciting times, I think.
Yeah, I think human beings are missing a ritual dimension to their lives, and that actually that's what's given human beings meaning for a very long time. And we need to find a way of incorporating magic and science, really, I think.
Yes, girl, preach it. You just got me excited. I'm like behind the scenes and I'm just like applauding. This is fabulous, fabulous.
Oh, I'll tell you, dear, you have to get over to the UK sometime. I know you've been promising to come over for a long time, but it would be so wonderful if you could come over, because you could work with us on this developing idea at Sync Pong. The only thing I'm concerned about is that the name tends to have strange connotations, but apparently it's because they started with ping pong, and if you go downstairs, they have ping pong tables, but it's such a wonderful venue. And it really is good, and it's right on the edge of the city, so it's really easy for people to get to. And I think
people interested there, but then we need a temple site on a geomagnetic anomaly.
We do. So we need to find one. So this is where we work on, and we try and find this somewhere, somehow. And I just think that we're going to be guided there. As our group have said on many occasions, 2020 is going to be a really intriguing year, and one that I'm very, very excited in, because there's something in the air.
It feels like a sort of speeding up of energy.
Yes, it does.
It's very much speeding up the energy, and I think that we do. And various people, and Sam Treasure's just posted on to say, magic and science, we're going to need more purple capes. And I think we are.
This time, though.
and Lorraine Henry has just said a wonderful thing. The poppy goddess of Gnosis is sleep related.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, we have all these links that we're pulling together. And it really is happening to us now. And very much the way in which today's experiment seems to have gone extremely well in terms of going out live as well. So it means we're going to be reaching more people and really making it happen. Sarah, you've been absolutely extraordinary guest, as all our previous guests are extraordinary. And it really is going to be an interesting few months. And I'm just so excited to know you guys and be working with you guys. I'm deeply honored to be doing so. And our next guest next month will be James Orak, who's the man of mystery, because James now lives out in Hawaii, as far as I understand it. And he is an expert on 5-MeO-DMT. And he seemed to drop off the circuit for a long time. And he wrote an amazing book called Tryptamine Palace, which has been a huge influence on me. So we're really looking forward to that as well. And you guys can then all listen in as well and come in with your comments. What I need to do is to gain a technique whereby I can read what's coming in on my feed and comments as well. But we'll work on that. But thanks, Sarah. As always, thanks, Dia Nunez over there in Denver in Colorado. And thanks to you guys in the background that have actually listened in on this. This has been a great experiment and it's worked. The only bad thing about today is that my team, Tranmere Rovers, were absolutely smashed to pieces by Manchester United. But other than that, it's been a great day. So thank you very much. Okay, see you guys.
Bye-bye. Bye, Dia.
Bye.